Welcome to the Deep Bass Podcast, where we take a hard look at the element that makes or breaks games, the music. I'm Peter Thomas, and I'm joined by my co-host, Cody Haltom, and we are happy to have you along with us on our journey through Sonic the Hedgehog 2. How's it going, Cody?
You got the name right.
I know. I got the name right. I got the game right. There's no subtitle this time. Did everything good.
Yeah, so now it's when everything breaks.
That's right. I know. Skype's going to crash. My hard drive's going to corrupt, and that'll be it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Peter. This show runs flawlessly.
Never a problem ever.
Yeah, I almost want us to have like a counter on like our Twitter where it's like days since an accident.
Yeah, days since last mess up.
Yeah. And then we just won't tell anyone that we're recording and it just goes back to zero.
Right. How's everything going? Good?
Yeah, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, man. I can't complain. We were originally intended to have a guest today, but our guest had some issues and wasn't able to make it. So it is just us two today, but I'm side-eyeing for whenever he listens to this episode and doing the whole Game of Thrones.
Shame.
Yeah, I just noticed that you changed it back because it did have his name in the doc and now it just says guest again. I didn't catch that.
I know. You hurt my feelings, Josh. I am deeply saddened by your absence, but it's okay. We enjoy this stuff regardless. And unfortunately, we weren't able to shift gears and try something out. It was just a little too difficult. So we're moving ahead with Sonic. I'm morbidly curious because I know this is not something that you have had a whole lot of exposure with. So I'm very curious to see how you enjoyed this and how everything kind of played out for you. Now, have you, I don't want to get too much into the history, but have you played Sonic the Hedgehog 2 ever? Like, is this your first time ever really experiencing it? How is that for you?
The Sonic games run together because they are so similar. So I think in the doc, where we have a list where what games have I played, what games have you played? I think this one says, I am sure I had to at some point, right? Just growing up. Do I have memories tied to Sonic the Hedgehog 2? No.
Gotcha. It probably doesn't say much, but I was younger whenever I experienced a lot of these for the first time. But even now, I've got copies of them, whether it's the Sega Genesis Mini and things like that. They still run together for me too. And I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. If it's more like they all play pretty consistently, so I just naturally, they all kind of blend together, or is it that they're just so unremarkable from one another that I just don't really recall? You know, it's hard to say.
My own personal bias says that they're unremarkable, and that's nothing against Sonic. I mean, growing up in the console wars, when they were first really ramping up between Nintendo and Sega, they needed something. They needed their Mario, and that's what Sonic became. Is it a game that I particularly enjoy playing? No, not really. Do I respect what it did for the industry, and particularly Sega? Absolutely.
There's actually a documentary, and I think you and I have talked about it, but it's on Netflix right now. I think it's called High Score. It's a limited series. It's only like 3 episodes or something like that. But they actually go into the whole console wars bit in great detail, and they talk about why Sonic came to be. The head of Sega of America at the time was basically given freedom to do what he wanted, but they were like, we need you to answer for Nintendo's Mario. We need something. So he had like this whole, it was like a 5 or 6 step plan of what he was going to do. He had things like make games seem more mature on the Sega Genesis. He wanted to have a mascot that was similar to Mario, but something that was better than Mario. And again, more mature, more edgy, that kind of thing. And I say edgy without a pun, believe it or not. The one other thing was they wanted to make fun of Nintendo. All of the advertisement was like a direct attack at people who own Nintendo. It's like, oh, you got a Nintendo? Psh, that's nothing. Sega Genesis is where it's at.
Yeah, 2 things, because we did discuss this a bit, but one of the advertising things that I remember from being a kid was Sega does what Nintendo don't, the attack ad kind of thing. The other thing, something that I own, it's a book. I'm looking at it. It's actually called Console Wars, and it's by Blake Harris. He and Seth Rogen turned that book, which is purely about what we're talking about, Nintendo and Sega and the clash of these two titans at the time. They actually made it into a documentary, and I think it's either on CBS streaming services or Hulu. It's one or the other. I haven't been able to watch it yet, but from what I've read of the book, I really, really want to, because it looks fascinating having grown up in that era.
I've got that on my list of one of the things I need to pick up and read. Probably long overdue to say this, but there is a podcast that I listened to for a long time before it kind of slowed down to almost a stop. And it was really where I got the inspiration for doing Deep Bass. But it was called Back in My Play, and a bunch of guys got together. I believe the main host, his name's Kevin Larrabee. He basically gets a game, they play it over a couple of weeks, and then they come out with the episode where they talk about the game itself. In that podcast, they have a small segment about music, but it's not really their focus. It's more about the game itself, how it still plays today, that kind of thing. They talk about Console Wars, the game and the film or documentary, whatever it is. It's something that's been on my radar. I've got to really check it out. But the person who put that together, I believe they interviewed them. They talk about how they just went hardcore into digging into the history of all this stuff. And the guys who were interviewed in the book were very open with discussing Nintendo, obviously a little more private, I think, but the guys over at Sega were just incredibly open about discussing all of the things that they did to make Sega as successful as it was at the time.
Yeah, and when you get around to picking up the book, you will absolutely see that Sega was, or the Sega people were completely like transparent. They didn't give a crap at all. You know, they just told it how it was. And so it does gear more towards a Sega perspective than Nintendo, just because he had like unfiltered access to Sega people. Like They were just so open. It's more of a Sega focused book, but it is about that generation, and I really need to finish that.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off the history here. I felt like since this is our first Sega Genesis game on the podcast, felt like it deserved a little bit of history because it's a big deal. I mean, that was a monumental time in gaming where at the time before that, consoles were non-existent, and then Nintendo is this giant who comes through and basically owns the market. And here comes these other scrappy guys from out of nowhere, and they're just like, hey, we can do it too, but we can do it better. So speaking specifically on Sonic the Hedgehog 2, this is a 1992 platform game developed and published by Sega for the Sega Genesis. It is the second main entry in the Sonic the Hedgehog series, as if you couldn't guess by the two, and introduced Sonic's sidekick, Miles Tails Prower, controllable by a second player. Development began in November of 1991 by Japanese and American staff at Sega Technical Institute in California. Like the original Sonic, the music was composed by Masato Nakamura, who is a bassist and songwriter of the J-pop band Dreams Come True. Nakamura began composing early in development with only concept images for reference, taking a very similar approach to what he did in Sonic 1. Nakamura would treat Sonic the Hedgehog 2 as a film and design the music around the atmosphere that he felt from the images of the stages. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 sold over 6 million Genesis cartridges, making it the second best-selling Genesis game behind the original Sonic. Cited as one of the greatest video games of all time, it received acclaim for its level design, visuals, and music. It has been re-released multiple times and remastered as well on several consoles since its launch. And I felt like saving us all the heartache of going through all the different consoles that it's been released. We'll just say that you can probably still pick it up on something that you own.
Yeah, that's very true. One thing I just learned, and it blows my mind, Tails had a name?
Yeah, Miles Prower was Tails' actual name. And they actually show it if you turn on the game and then kind of let it run through its little demo reel, I guess is what they're called. Mm-hmm. It'll actually show it there as well. We touched on it a little bit, but tell me a bit about your history with the game, even if it isn't all that much. How much exposure have you had? Where did you first play it, if you can remember, that kind of thing?
No, I got all that because, as you know, I only have one sentence for my history on this.
I know. I read the note and I laughed my ass off. I'm like,
yeah,
oh, okay.
I have written down, I have like none as my memory. No, my best friend growing up, Daniel, he had a Genesis, which I always thought was weird because he had an NES. And then instead of getting the Super Nintendo, he got a Genesis. I was like, why not just stick with Nintendo? Because like we couldn't trade games with each other. So that was kind of like a frustration of ours. So my only real experience with Sonic would be over at his house. And we would always be either playing Sonic, one of them, because we were talking a little bit. At a certain point, they do kind of run together. It was either Sonic, Mortal Kombat, or NBA Jam. Those were the three go-to Genesis games that we would play. So this is one of those, I'm sure I have played it, but even if I haven't, I've played a Sonic from that era. So I get the gist of what the game is. So I felt comfortable enough doing this episode because, I mean, who doesn't know Sonic?
It is one of those things where I feel like if you knew somebody with a Sega, they had to have had a Sonic game. I'm pretty sure it was a pack-in for a lot of the consoles as well. Both the first and the second were at some point. There's almost no possibility that you could have been at somebody's house with a Sega and not have played it.
Yeah, I mean, it was as readily playable as Mario. Everyone has a Mario game if you have a Nintendo console, most of the time anyway. What about you? What's your history with this?
I was one of the kids who did exactly as you said. So I had a regular Nintendo and then bumped up to the Super Nintendo because it makes logical sense to me.
Yeah.
But I do know a lot of people who did the NES to Genesis switch. And maybe it was the mature look of the games and the console and things like that. I look at those consoles and I just see older, not so well designed consoles. But a lot of people felt that the Sega Genesis looked a little more sleek and refined as like a more mature console. And I didn't think so, but that was just me. I mean, what kind of console do you know has a volume switch on it for when you hook up headphones? It felt very weird and flimsy to me. So yeah, never owned a Sega myself, but my youngest uncle on my dad's side is actually really close in age to all of us nephews. Whenever I would go over to my grandmother's house, which I was over there quite frequently. We lived probably about 10 minutes apart from one another. I was there a lot. I'd go over to him and, he had a Sega there. And I would always ask him, hey, can I play your Nintendo? And he would get so pissed, so pissed. He's like, it's not a Nintendo, it's a Sega. And it's like, oh, okay. It goes back to, and they talk about this in that documentary I mentioned, Nintendo had become such a household name that everything you did was Nintendo. So that was all I knew it as. I would sit down and I'd play different games. He had Sonic. He would have Streets of Rage. He'd have a couple other different titles. I always gravitated back to Sonic because it was that mainstream platformer. When I played it, I could relate it to Mario. I'm like, okay, this has very similar concepts. It's a platformer. It's very easy to pick up and play. I mean, the controller had 3 buttons and every single one of them did the same thing. They jumped. So It's like, there was no complexity to it or anything like that. It was fun to play, easy to pick up, hard to master kind of thing. And I was blown away by exactly what they talk about, which is the speed. I'm like, this is a game where you can go so fast that you literally run off the right side of the screen and can no longer see yourself. To me, that seems like a design flaw, but I was also very fascinated by that whole mechanic. I never really got very far in the game until much later when I learned about emulation, things like that. I believe my first playthrough and finishing it was actually on an emulator, but I later picked up copies on, I think my 3DS has a copy of Sonic, and I have a copy on, maybe it's the Virtual Console when that was a thing. And then I also got the Sega Genesis Mini. So I've got this game in various forms all over the place. It's so easy to get anymore because it's packed into everything. If you're looking for a way to play it, I think the most authentic is that Sega Genesis Mini now because it feels like the old console again.
Why do I remember the Genesis having 6 buttons, not 3?
They eventually did do that. So they came out with another gamepad later that had the X, Y, and Z buttons.
Yeah.
That were also there. But yeah, the OG one was this giant black boomerang that only had 3 buttons on it. There was like so much plastic. I couldn't imagine there was any electronics inside of it at all.
Just like a small little circuit board and some wires holding it all together.
You know, we talked about the controllers of ye old times, and I would say that the Sega Genesis controller, it felt the most comfortable to hold for long periods of time, but it was an awkward controller to use. Like it didn't feel natural to press the buttons on it and things like that, to me anyways.
It was kind of like the Duke of the Xbox generation. Whenever Xbox came out onto the scene with its weird controller that had the white and black buttons needlessly way up above your other buttons and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it did have that kind of aesthetic to it. So it was always very strange. And the start button, I remember being also really ridiculously high on the controller and indented into it. So like to press it, you actually had to push into the controller.
Oh, yeah.
It was very odd.
It was clear that adults made this game and they held it in their hands and were like, this is cool. And then they gave it to a kid and their kid was like it's just this huge thing in their tiny hands. I
mean, that's exactly it. They were marketing towards the older gamers. So you're probably.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Well, shit, I'll just shut up then.
It's funny to kind of discover that as you go along and realize that, oh, yeah, this actually wasn't meant for me. That's why it didn't feel right.
But I'm a gamer and I'm a kid. All games are meant for me. But now, like as an adult and thinking about it and having a conversation, I'm like, that checks out.
Right. Shout out to my Uncle Rick for letting me play his console, even though I was probably some annoying kid who was obsessed with games. I mean, hell, I still am now, but allowing me to continue to feed my obsession. And I'm sure he's going to get brought up a lot more because it was because of him that I got to play Sega. It was because of him that I got to play PlayStation. I didn't have these consoles when I was growing up, so he did, and I got to play a lot of my favorites that way. So big kudos to him for allowing me to be the annoying nephew to play all his games, even if he didn't want to.
Absolutely.
All right, sir. What do you say? You want to kick off some of this music? Because we have an interesting soundtrack here to go through, and I've got some fun tidbits at the end of this that I want to talk about, specifically around the sounds that came from the Sega Genesis. But we'll get to that in a little bit. You want to tell us about your number 5?
Yeah, sure. All right. So my number 5 is Oil Ocean Zone. I feel like someone messed up somewhere. There's another water level on this soundtrack called Aquatic Ruin Zone. Now, if you had sat me down and had me listen to this track and guess the title, I would have said it was the track to Aquatic Ruin Zone. This track just sounds straight up Egyptian. This doesn't even sound like a water level at all. Listening to this sounds like we are running through a temple collecting rings. I'm not sure why they decided to use this track here, but I honestly enjoy it, and it does a great job of painting a picture just for the wrong level.
Maybe I'm a little biased, but I felt the same way whenever you mentioned that the sound seems like it's Egyptian. I was saying Middle Eastern, which is kind of all that same general area as far as like how the music kind of comes out. Yeah, I got some very serious Middle Eastern vibes, and it makes sense when I thought about it because it's on an oil rig. It's like, where does most of the oil come from? The Middle East. So, yeah, that's kind of where my brain connected it all together. I like this song quite a lot, actually, despite the more repetitive bass line for it. The stage itself was wretched for me. I think that most of my runs through this game really end at this area if I don't use any save states or anything like that. I did enjoy the track. It wasn't enough for me to put it on my list, but it was definitely a solid pick.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, you said that you would get to this level and quit. How far into the game is it?
It's more than halfway. I want to say closer to maybe like the 3/4 mark. And it's not so much that I would get here and quit. It's more like it was so hard I'd run out of lives. So if I didn't stock up on enough lives by the time I got to this point, then the run just would not make it. Sonic is one of those things where if you run out of lives, then it's a game over. You're back to the title screen. There's no continues or anything like that.
Right. And that's what I remember. So it's about where it is on the soundtrack then. Got it.
Yeah. The soundtrack that we listened to, or the one that I had linked and you decided to ignore,
hey.
It was generally in order of the stages that you played.
Okay. And for the record, the only reason why I didn't use the link that you put was I saw that you had already put your picks in here and I didn't want to be spoiled. So I just took a guess as to which one to listen to. All right. But we'll get there later for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Always the excuses over there.
I hate you. All right. What's your number 5?
All right. My number 5 is the Casino Night Zone 2-player mode or edition or something, whatever you want to call it. It's the one you hear when you play multiplayer. It's probably a given as to why I chose this track over the actual one from the single player game. But the bass line that drives this track the whole way through just rips through me so hard. While I'd probably argue that the single player track sounds a little more quote unquote casino-esque than this one does, I put a lot of time in the multiplayer part of this game and thoroughly enjoyed the track a lot more. They're both not without their merits, though, all things considered.
Given the bass in this track, I should have pinned this as a pick for you instantly. This has the same tone as the single player version, yet it's somehow, I don't know, more sneaky, if that makes sense. It's a good track that I like, but I just prefer the single player version a little bit more. A question I wanted to ask you as well. On the soundtrack, there are only 2-player, quote unquote, versions of certain tracks. Why is that?
The 2-player version was a watered down version of the main game. They had these levels that weren't actually the ones, they were like chunks of the main level. They had different songs to go with it, but it was only 3 stages at first. And I think if you did something, I don't know if it was a cheat code or if you beat the game or something, it would unlock a 4th stage. But yeah, there was only 4 stages total that you could actually play in multiplayer.
Okay, that checks out, because I'm listening to this and I'm like, well, why didn't they just do one for every track? But since it's a watered down version, that makes sense.
All right, sir. What about your number 4?
My number 4 is what we were just talking about. Mine's the original Casino Night Zone. If I didn't know the name of this track, I would say this took place either in an Old West bar or a casino. There's just something about that ragtime nature of this track that just tells you where it takes place. The swing and the short call and answer sections of this track, to me, are just delightful to listen to, and why I prefer it a little bit more than the 2-player version.
I mentioned this in my track, but yours definitely has more of the vibe, the casino vibe, than mine does. If you listen to mine, you may not be able to peg it if you had no idea what the name of it was as a casino track, but yours is hands down. I can hear that. What I didn't particularly care for in this track was the slower tempo. It basically removes the bass that actually lives in the 2-player track completely out of this track. The level itself, I understand why they would pace it down a little bit tempo wise, just because there are a lot of areas where you're stuck doing these little pinball mini game things or slot machine mini game things. So it doesn't move as quickly as some of the other stages in the game. So I guess I can understand why they did it. But to me, it was like, well, if you remove the speed from a Sonic game, you're removing the essence of Sonic. So that was why I couldn't put it on this list for me anyways, but definitely understandable. And I think the track fits the stage very well.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. All right, man. What is your number 4?
My number 4 is the boss theme. I feel like I've been putting boss themes on my tracks for the last couple of episodes here. The Dr. Robotnik fights were always in these really insane contraptions attached to his little Wily type hover ship. This song made you experience that to a whole new level. When the level music fades and this music comes on, you know you're in for an epic confrontation. While the battle style is fairly simplistic, the strategies for each boss change based on their attack patterns. I also wanted to tell you, Cody, that you'd be happy to know that Sega does not follow Nintendo's lead on these battles. Maybe they wanted them to last a little longer, or maybe they just hated us as gamers, but every boss requires 8 hits, not 3 for these battles.
This track has some layers, man. That was my first impression whenever I first listened to this track, because it is what it is. I do like the track. Also, I do remember the boss battles being longer, and as a kid being like, oh my God, when does this end? Because I'm a Nintendo kid. I'm spoiled. 3 hits and then you're done and you're on to the next thing. So I do have that memory. This is really clearly a boss fight whenever you listen to it. What I appreciate about it, though, is how they managed to almost make it sound like a choir was singing in the background in the second half of this track, which I'm not sure what we're calling this quote unquote instrument that we're listening to, but I just really kind of appreciated how they were able to work the mechanics of the cartridge to be able to get it to sound like that.
Well, Cody, don't you know it's obviously the dun 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 dun. That's the instrument it is.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Do you understand like what I mean when I say like the choir? Did you hear that too, though?
Yeah, a little bit. It's almost like they put the music together to sound very much like vocals, even though it's not. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's what really just kind of impressed me about this track, because back in the day, vocals in games were not really a thing, at least not until later. I mean, in Star Fox, you get good luck, and that's about the extent of it. I was just kind of impressed by that.
Vocals had to be compressed so hard because they took up so much space that if there is any speech in a game like Street Fighter or, like you said, Star Fox, it was always muffled. You hear, good luck.
Yeah, and I'm only saying Star Fox because that's the only game that I can remember from that era where, oh, wait, NBA Jam had some.
He's on fire, man.
Yeah. Boom shakalaka. But that's an episode from later.
Yeah, I know. I feel like that we got to cover that one now.
Okay, that would be ridiculous.
All right, sir. Tell me your number 3.
Okay, my number 3 was on the soundtrack that I listened to and not the one that Peter listened to. Number 3 is Ending 1. Obviously, I've never heard this track before. As I was listening to this, to the start of this at the very least, I had one thought. Is this the 16-bit version of Ground Control to Major Tom? They sound so familiar to me, at least in the fact that they have a very similar cadence, at the very least. This is obviously what you hear when you beat the game. It's a bit slower than the majority of the soundtrack, which I feel like is intentional, almost telling the player, hey, you can stop running now. It's a different tone from the rest of the soundtrack, which as the ending track, I really appreciate.
When you originally said that, I looked at your list and I'm like, no, all the songs that you have on your playlist that you listen to were on mine too. And then I went to yours and I'm like, let me just check. So I spot checked all of the songs that you picked from 1 to 5. And I'm like, oh, this number 3 is different.
Yes.
Going back to the song, I actually had to listen to Ground Control to Major Tom again because I wanted to hear what you were referring to. It's been so long since I've heard that song. I couldn't quite pin it. And I heard it and I'm like, he's damn right. He is damn right. It sounds so much like it. Definitely not like a 1-to-1, but it's very close. If you laid the two on top of one another, you might get mixed up.
I made that note in there. And then I was listening to this on Friday and I was going insane over this because I was like, this can't be just me. So I reached out to our oldest fan, Johnny, and another buddy of mine, Michael. I sent them both the track and I was like, does this sound like Ground Control to Major Tom at the start? And I remember Johnny just texted me back, holy shit, yes, it does. I was like, all right, then they both heard it, obviously, but I was like, it's good enough for me to put in my notes. That way I'm not sounding completely crazy because, after all, I am comparing Sonic 2 to David Bowie.
Right. I've only beaten Sonic maybe twice in my life, but I'm pretty sure this is the interlude that plays right before the actual ending theme, which is on my list, but a little bit further up. So I'll get to more of that in a bit. But one of the things it was kind of interesting was that after listening to both now, I see why you'd pick this and not the other one, because it fits more with what you like. And I'll talk more about it once I'm able to speak on the one that I picked. So I'll come back to that piece, but I definitely get why you picked this one. It is a lot. Well, first of all, it's original, so you don't hear this anywhere else. It is very much like a firm conclusion to the game. You hear it and you're like, okay, I know this is the end. I've finished my job. Dr. Robotnik is foiled once again. We're wrapping up. And I liked your analogy of this is like, hey, you can stop running now. Kick off the shoes. You've done your job for the day. You've saved all the little animals from the little contraptions and you're good to go.
Thanks for that. Because that's really kind of what it is. And again, Peter's speaking vague for obvious reasons, but we'll continue this conversation in a little bit. In the meantime, what is your number 3?
I love my number 3. I fought really hard. And if I didn't love my number 2 and I wasn't very impressed by my number 1, then my number 3 would be my number 1 because, well, I'll start with what it is. It's Chemical Plant Zone. Every time I play this game, I want to get through Emerald Hill Zone just to hear Chemical Plant. It's the second world that you run into. It is both my favorite song and the worst stage I've ever played in a Sonic game. Really, any stage that has you underwater that you can drown in is horrible because that music that plays during that sequence is horrific. And I panic and I get palms sweaty knees weak, arms are heavy, the whole shebang. But once you're out of the water and that music is not playing, this track makes it better. It is groovy as hell. The fast rhythm of it fits so well with how the loops and the track of this stage goes. I would be surprised if this isn't on your list, which I know that it is not, but the drums is what really carry this along for me. So I was like, Cody's going to have this on his list. He's got to. I get the 80s disco vibe too when I hear it, which really matches up with the color scheme that they use over the stage. There's a lot of neon blue and yellow in the tracks and just lots of vibrant popping colors all throughout.
First note when I listened to this was, Persona, is that you? Because it gives me similar vibes to that soundtrack, despite being much older. You bring up the drowning thing. Drowning is my biggest fear, and that music gives me too much anxiety, so we're just going to skip over that whole thing completely. I get the industrial vibes from this for sure, but there's nothing that really screams chemical plant, though. I do love this track, but it's not because of the drums. It is because of the 80s vibes that you mentioned. It could just be the old man in me where I do like music from that generation more than I do like some of the modern stuff. But no, this honestly almost made my list. I can't speak as to why, because easily it could be my number one as well. But my list is what it is for its own reasons. But I love this entire soundtrack. This was a lot of fun to go through. I didn't hate any of these except for the drowning music.
Right. I know. It's like the minute you see a stage that has it, the drowning music plays in your head and you're immediately just in anxiety mode. But what's interesting about what you had said, though, was that you said that it sounded like an industrial plant, but you didn't get the chemical plant side. I think it's kind of a play on words. So the industrial plant side of it is the song. The chemical side of it is more the objects that you fight. There was like those little bubbles that shot up everywhere. And if I remember correctly, the water was like purple, not blue. So I think it was meant to be like you were inside of a chemical plant that way.
Like we got acid flying around us that we're trying to avoid and crap. Okay, that would make sense. That part of it, I mean, I'm not saying like every track has to be what the name says it is. This is just what I'm going off of. Like I said, I still like the track. I knew this was going to be on your list, and I'm surprised you didn't pull an audible and change it to your number one before you said the name of it.
It was close. I'm telling you, it was a really hard fight with my top three here. It hurt me a little bit putting it at number 3, but hey, it's respectable. I mean, there was 30 some songs on this soundtrack.
It depends on which one you listen to, but hey.
Okay, give or take.
Mine had 32. Yours had like 29 or something like that.
Yeah. Anyways, let's move on to your number 2.
Number 2, Wing Hill Fortress Zone. This starts and is the most regal track we have covered today, which is really saying something since we've covered actual castle tracks in the past. It is really prevalent at the start of the track, and then it's almost like darkness descends over us. The track changes and becomes something more sinister. However, the track stays somehow positive, almost like we're trying to fight off this invader, and we end up winning in the end. This track knows what it's supposed to be, and it does it very well.
this particular song, I had to go back and actually watch a playthrough of where this was because I didn't remember it. Or I guess the better term was that I thought it was in Sonic 1, the stage I was thinking of, but it wasn't. I was correct in remembering. So you're actually flying on like a biplane, like you're standing on top of the wings before you get to this giant air fortress thing. If the oil ocean zone is the first place that I would end a run at, this would be the second place. So if I make it past oil zone, wing fortress is almost the next spot where I have the hardest time with it. And I don't recall why. I just know it's really difficult. While I appreciate what this song was going for and its kind of like grandeur, especially with how massive this airship is that you're walking on, I actually didn't like this track at all. It's way too slow for a Sonic stage. And there's a lot more jump platforming kind of back and forth where you don't get to just run full speed and sprint around a loop to loop and all that stuff that you've been doing for stage upon stage. That's all gone here. And this becomes more of like almost like a Mario platformer. So if you can think of the airships that you would be on in Super Mario Brothers 3, it's not unlike that. The difference being that it's not side scrolling or auto scroller rather. And you do a lot of back and forth traversing and a little more vertical traversing because Sonic jumps a lot higher and things like that. This makes sense for a giant airship. It really does. But it just does not, for me, make sense to be put in as a Sonic the Hedgehog stage.
Okay, I'm going to try to defend this a little bit or just have a conversation about it. I agree with you that the track is slow and it does not belong in a Sonic game, at least not in this capacity, a boss fight or end of game, something like that, maybe something special. I agree with you on, but based on your description, it sounds like the track actually goes with what the level itself is.
Yes, it very much does. If you took Sonic out of this and put Mario in it, or take this level out and put it with another game, I'm all for it. I think that's good. I did not care for it in Sonic itself.
Okay, that's what I was hearing. I just wanted to clarify and make sure that we were all on the same page. Got it.
Right.
All right, but what is your number 2?
My number 2 is arguably my favorite song. This and Chemical Plant Zone fight for my favorite song. Even though it didn't make number 1, this is more of like a personal preference, but it's Mystic Cave Zone.
Shocker, Peter puts another cave track on his list.
I know. Maybe I'm a sucker for cave songs and I didn't realize it. But so before I actually begin about the music itself, I wanted to note that when we were first designing the idea for the Deep Bass podcast, I had actually hired someone to do our intro based on the Sega Genesis sound chip. It was because of songs like this with the really awesome bass lines, the deep and grittier sounds that I really enjoyed what came out of it. I'm actually going to play a sample of what that sounds like now and let everybody hear it. And then I'll come back and we'll talk about the actual song itself. The Sega Genesis sound chip was known for that grittier, almost muddy sounding instruments that it could produce. This song really exemplifies it well. There's a lot of interesting sounds that kind of come out of this track that add a ton of character to it. And it really fits well with the theme of this level. Obviously, the bass line in the song is what sold it for me, but the entire track is incredibly beautiful and worth hearing.
Christ, it's been so long since I even heard or thought about the old intro. This almost made my list for none of those reasons. This track is all over the place, man. This sounds to me more like a haunted circus than it does anything. It's a stretch for me to make it fit as a cave track, but I still really enjoy how unique of a track this is.
When you wrote down that it was more of like a circus theme, I was like, oh, yeah, I guess I can kind of hear that for sure. When I hear it, I definitely don't think cave. And if you actually see the level of this, it's not, I don't know why they call it a cave, honestly. It's more of like an area with a lot of rocks around it, but it's not actually inside of a cave the whole time, if I'm remembering correctly. And I'm trying to think of, it's almost mountainous than it is more cave. Again, my memory could be failing me a little bit here, and I could be thinking of something else, but
we're old. It's okay.
Old and tired, and that'll do a number on your brain. I definitely hear the vibe that you picked up with this. It's definitely fits for something else, but still a weird and wonderful track to hear regardless.
Yeah, this is another one of those that I listened to and I should have pegged that was going to be on yours. I like to try and guess what's going to be on your list whenever I'm doing this. I should have had you pegged for this one for sure.
Yeah, definitely. All right, sir, let's move into your number one.
I feel like we're going to get judged for our number ones a little bit, but my number one is Emerald Hill Zone. This is the first level of the game, so it really sets the tone of what you can expect from the game that you're about to experience. It's very energetic, yet light and happy. Sonic is far from a serious game. It's all about saving animals from being turned into robots as fast as you can. While this track tells you nothing about the plot at all and does nothing to remind you of an emerald or a hill, it is a charming track to start the game.
The classic Sonic track.
Yes.
I laughed at your notes because when you take the names of these songs and literally break them down, it's like, yeah, that's actually really bizarre. When you see Emerald Hill, you're like, I don't see emeralds and I don't really see hills.
Yeah.
But when I see that, I'm like, oh yeah, green rolling hills. And that's exactly what Emerald Hill Zone is.
It's Green Hill Zone 2.0, basically.
Yeah, exactly. They just wanted to change up the name. While I don't know that I like this song more than Green Hill Zone, speaking of the devil, the pacing is quite nice. It's a very catchy first song. I find that when I'm thinking about Sonic songs or I'm like humming them in my head or something like that, Green Hill is probably first on that list. And then Emerald Hill probably falls pretty high up. It's not like it's this bad song by any stretch. I also don't know if you remember the multiplayer song for this particular zone, but did you think it was like a major step down?
Yes.
Yeah, it was like, I was listening to it and I'm like, okay, so I obviously have a peeve. It's been a theme throughout this episode where if you slow down the tracks in Sonic, I feel like they don't fit. The Emerald Hill Zone 2-player mode, not only is it slow, but it's tropical. And I'm like, what part of being in a song with a slow and tropical vibe makes you feel like running fast? I want to lay on a beach and drink a pina colada or something.
Dude, it's a completely different track. And with some of the others, like everyone just heard, because I have down Casino Night Zone and you have the 2-player version of that, they can tell that those two are clearly inspired by each other. They're very similar with just slight differences, but there's a stark difference between the single-player and 2-player version of this song. It's shocking, really.
The Casino Night song is actually the only one that sounds related. Mystic Cave does not. The two of those sound completely different. The 2-player version also sucks worse than the original. I forget what the last one is off the top of my head, but I'm fairly certain that that one as well is also very different and doesn't fit the same way.
Hidden Palace, that's it. I knew it started with an H.
So actually, Hidden Palace is not in the original stages. It's just in 2-player, right?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Because I was looking for it and I was wondering why it wasn't there. That's the one we were talking about. Everything's coming full circle for Cody.
Yeah.
So many boxes just went chink, 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 little check marks right next to them. So there we go. That's my mind in working in real time there.
Right.
All right, man. What about your number one?
My number one is on your soundtrack, it would be called Ending 2. And on my soundtrack, it was called Credits. There's nothing original or fantastic with the credits theme itself. You listen to it and you're just like, oh, I see what they did there. That's pretty fun. But what I love about the song and why it's so high on my list is that it is actually a mashup of all the songs that you've played throughout the game. And I feel like that's a really solid way to wrap up a game. It's like, hey, let's go back and look at all the places that you'd been to get to where you are now. As the credits roll, you can hear each track that has been played thus far blended together. It's not the most glamorous mashup in the world. I mean, they were working off of a Sega Genesis, but it feels really cool to go back and see that. And if I remember correctly, it's been a long time since I've seen the credits, but I'm pretty sure that they show you little glimpses of those areas as they go too. This is something that Sega has done pretty much throughout the Sonic games. So Sonic 1 and Sonic 3 for sure do this. And I believe Sonic Mania does as well. I don't have as much experience with the rest of them, so I can't say for sure, but I can't imagine that they've broken from that trend if that's something that they've done consistently. It does remain one of my favorite parts about beating these games is being able to hear that. I mentioned before that I would come back to this based on your ending one. So the reason I thought you would pick the ending one over this one is because ending one is a lot more original and fits the bill of being an ending song, so to speak. Whereas if I'm you and I'm sitting down and I'm listening to the song, you're going to be like, oh, this is just the same songs again. I don't need that anymore. Thank you.
Yeah, but that doesn't take away from it. When I listened to this, I was like, didn't I just listen to all of these? So, I mean, you nailed that. I do actually like what they did with the credits. It does make sense to go back and kind of reflect on your journey of what got you to that point. So, no, I do like it. I like this whole soundtrack. And guess what? This is the whole soundtrack in one track. What's not to like about it? But yeah, my ending one was just a little bit more original, and it's almost like ending one is what plays at the final scene of the game, and then what your track is actually the credits. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly. I think that's how it actually plays out.
Oh, well, that would make sense then.
Yeah. I'm like, oh yeah, Cody, you just described exactly how it actually works. So great job.
Yeah, dude, I'm tired. Shut up. Get off me. I think both of our number ones are as basic as they come, but that doesn't take away from how good both of them actually are.
Yeah, I agree. You can't really complain about either one of them. In a way, they're safe picks. I feel like a lot of people would probably put them on their list and make it very high up, but I really don't care. I feel like that same feeling we get when we play, Super Mario Brothers or something like that. This is for Sega fans. This is home for them. So I think that it warranted having these tracks where they are.
Yeah. As Nintendo guys and PlayStation and Xbox guys, which you're getting around to, this is not our wheelhouse. So we do have to kind of like view it through that lens as to where if we would have had a guest on that could speak about this at great detail, their list would probably be very different than ours. Unfortunately, we don't have that this week.
Cough, cough, nudge, nudge, Josh.
Yep.
No, I'm just ragging on him. But
I know,
hey, regardless of Josh being here or not, we did make it through, and we are at the end of another episode.
Yes, we are. We finally covered. I didn't think we would ever get around to Genesis, honestly.
It was on the list. I just don't think it would have gotten here as quickly as it did. I didn't have plans on putting this one up so quickly, but I think it was worthwhile. I know our next episode is going to have a console we've already covered quite a bit, but I don't care because I am really looking forward to it.
Is that the one that's actually listed in the doc?
It is the one that's actually listed.
Give that to me right now. Like, let's go. I am so ready for next week.
Yeah, this next one is going to be a lot of fun. I'm not going to give too much away. Wrapping up on Sonic the Hedgehog 2, there was something I wanted to talk about. I originally thought about front loading it, but I didn't want the beginning part of the podcast to be too heavy with just a bunch of details and facts and stuff. So I moved this towards the end because it also ties in with our question of the episode. You and I were discussing off the podcast about how you were reading up on things. You had something in your notes where you said that was like something 8-bit song. And I was like, hey, I'm going to make a quick correction for you. It's actually 16-bit. And you were like, I knew it. It was supposed to be that. The web lied to me and I said it half lied to you. So the reason I said it half lied to you is because the Sega Genesis was incredibly unique. I don't know if you know this, but the Super Nintendo had Sony build its sound chip. It was a very high quality piece of machinery. Actually, Nintendo and Sony worked really well together. Okay. And almost did a console, which I think you do know that piece. So Sony and Nintendo actually were going to be partners for a little while, but that fell through. Before that partnership happened, they did make the sound chips for it. So Super Nintendo uses a Sony sound chip. The Sega Genesis, however, uses two sound chips. It uses a Yamaha sound chip, which is the one that produces the 16-bit noises. That's all your dark, gritty grunts and groans and fart noises and all that stuff that comes out of the Sega Genesis. And it was meant to emulate the arcade as much as possible, which most people, if you ask them which console plays arcade games better, they'll tell you the Sega Genesis does. That's because it was built to be like an arcade machine. I mean, Sega was known for being an arcade manufacturer before it ever became a console. The other sound chip that was in it was actually the same exact chip that they put inside of their Sega Master System. It's their 8-bit console, the one that contended with Nintendo.
Oh.
So there are videos out there, and I would encourage everybody listening to go find one. If I can find one, I will link it in the show notes. But there are videos out there that actually will break it apart and let you hear what part of the song is using the newer chip and which part of it uses the old one. If you're thinking of Green Hill Zone, for example, the part that goes da 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 da, all new chip for that one. Old chip is the do 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 do, that really high pitched part.
Yeah, I'm following what you're saying.
Yeah, that's why I was like, they were half correct. It does have an 8-bit chip in it, but it also has a 16-bit chip as well. And most of the games use both of them.
Yeah, because when I put that, like you had said, I was like, all right, this is a 16-bit, right? And then I was like, hold on, let me just double check in. I just Googled what bit is Sonic 2, and it just pops up 8-bit. And I was like, oh, well, I guess I'm been wrong all these years. So I put it in my notes as 8-bit. Then you texted me and corrected me. And I was like, I look like such a fake gamer right now,
Okay.
which is not the case. But I mean, that does give some explanation as to why at least that happened for me. But that is interesting that that pulls from both. And it does kind of create a bit more of a dynamic sound, but that's interesting.
So I'm about to blow your mind again.
Oh, shit.
Sonic 1 and Sonic 2 were also on the Sega Master System.
That I knew.
Maybe whenever you Googled what you did, it was pulling up the information from the 8-bit Sega Master System as opposed to the Sega Genesis.
It did because, and I'm remembering it now because it said right next to it, there was a box for the Master System. And I was like, I thought this thing came out on Genesis. But I was like, continues with notes no matter what.
It was really wild to me when I first came across that it was a Sega Master System game. And it was probably a couple years ago. This was pretty recent. I went and downloaded it because I wanted to see what it was like. And I'm surprised that they even attempted something like that on an 8-bit system. It runs so badly,
I
badly.
Can imagine.
Yeah, it was horrible. I mean, there's not a whole bunch to say. I would encourage everybody to go look at that too, because it is a mess. But it's cool to see where they came from to where they went. Obviously, the Sega Genesis did a much better job with handling the speed that they wanted to achieve with Sonic.
Yeah, I'm going to take a pass on looking that up because I feel like I would cringe at that a bit too much, honestly. It's kind of like we were talking episodes ago about how they ported a Donkey Kong to like a handheld back in the day, like Donkey Kong Land and that kind of stuff, and how I felt about those. I would have a feeling I would feel the same way about this. Yeah,
it clobbered the frame rate, didn't it?
Oh, it had to have. Yeah. Like, I haven't even seen the video of what you're talking about, but I just, there's no way that a Sonic game can run as smoothly given the hardware of that time. Like, it's not possible. So the camera has an occasional time in the Genesis games where it won't keep up. In the Sega Master System, it never keeps up. The character is almost always off the camera the entire time. You have no clue where you're going. Why not just slow the guy down? I don't know. That wasn't the motto of Sonic. Yeah, you got to go fast. Right. But that leads me to my question. So the question for this episode is, did you prefer the sound chip that the SNES had or the sound chip that the Sega Genesis had? I'm going to say Super Nintendo. And the only reason why, though, is I have more exposure with that. Listening to this soundtrack, I love it. This is a really awesome soundtrack. And I don't say that about many of our tracks. Hell, I hated last week. I don't know if it was necessarily better, more powerful. Yeah, because it had the 2. But did every developer or most developers take use of that? Wouldn't that be on them? Yes, they would have to choose to use both sound chips when they're composing it in order for them both to be used. I don't know what the actual ratio was or how common it was. The problem was I didn't find out about the 2-chip piece until much later, and I wasn't playing many, if any, Sega games at that time. So I'm not sure how common it was to use both. I would like to know. That would be interesting to kind of look at, see which ones did and which ones didn't, and especially if they were on both, like Aladdin was back in the day, and see how different they are or if they are the same. But I can't speak to which one. Like I said, I love what Sonic did with its soundtrack, but I got to give it to my boys at Nintendo because, I mean, Sony knows what they're doing, and it's clear to this day. I mean, the PlayStation 5 launches, next week, I think. I know about that whole partnership and how close they were. And we're like, people don't understand, like, these two were really, really close. They were like in bed together. They were that much of a unit back, in these days. That's why I'm going with Super Nintendo. What about you? I also agree that my vote would be in the Super Nintendo bucket. For me, it was more the kind of sounds that they could achieve.
in the SNES versus the Genesis. So there were a lot of titles that were cross-platform between the two. So a lot of the Disney titles came out on both. Mortal Kombat came out on both. And if you listen to them side by side, it just sounds cleaner. I mentioned earlier that the Sega Genesis sound chip sounded more muddied and grittier, and it matched up with arcades quite a bit. To me, I'd never really liked arcade sounds. You know, I played games like Gauntlet Legends and stuff like that in the arcades, and it just sounds... I know that most people don't really care about the sound in an arcade because it's loud and there's a lot of stuff going on, but I still did. And I just never really dug that kind of music. But what I will say is that the original games that came out for the Genesis, Sonic the Hedgehog, Earthworm Jim, Toe Jam and Earl, all those songs that came with those games were perfect for what they were. They just really nailed how they were supposed to sound. You know, if you gave me 5 soundtracks from the Super Nintendo and 5 soundtracks from the Sega Genesis and said, which ones sound better, I'm almost always going to go with the Super Nintendo.
I'm going to go back and listen specifically to Earthworm Jim, because that's a game I remember. I loved Earthworm Jim as a kid. But again, I played that on my Super Nintendo. That wasn't like an exclusive. It was just made by Sega and somehow got ported over there, and I'm not sure how. So that would be an interesting one to listen to get a true one-to-one, you know, a game that was made for this console that then gets ported to the other, and how different does it sound?
How about, I didn't realize that Earthworm Jim did come out on the Super Nintendo. I only knew it for Sega.
Really?
Yep.
Yeah, because I remember renting it, and I never owned a Genesis. I knew that it was on Genesis, obviously, but I distinctly remember being in my parents' house playing it.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that. I'll have to listen to both as well, because now I'm morbidly curious. All right, Cody. Well, with that, man, we are going to wrap up. But for those of you who are listening, if you want to answer the question of the episode, please be sure to tweet us at Deep Base Podcast on Twitter. You can find us everywhere else, but Twitter is probably where we're most active. So come hang out with us, chat with us about the game, the episode, and our question, and let us know what you think. But with that, we are going to head off for the day. Thank you guys so much for listening. Cody, thank you for, as always, being the co-host to this podcast. I really appreciate you.
Anytime, bud.
Thanks for listening, guys, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye.